Hi again. Let's take a look at the handout on harmony fundamentals. And I'm going to quickly go through the first couple of pages because I figure that most of you already know about these sorts of things. So I'm just going to very quickly scan through that. I'll let you read this mostly on your own. Really, this should be very familiar. And the only thing to maybe be looking for is some terminology issues. So we're just going to get into some very basics of harmony fundamentals here, just to make sure that we're on the same page. So first off, just to remind you, we have 4 different triad types: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. And again, I just assume you all do know that at this point. And then maybe just also these next one, you also have 5/7 chords. These might be a little, at least these are the 5/7 chord types that we use in tonal music. Major, 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 minor, minor, minor. By the way, I'd usually just call that one a minor 7th. Half diminished. This is the symbol for half diminished. It's a circle with a line through it. And fully diminished. And just to review real quick how to do these. For a major 7th chord, you have a major triad at the bottom, and then from the root to the 7th, you have a major 7th. For though to be honest, what I would recommend you do is just write the major triad and then add a major 3rd on top. For the major minor 7th, major triad, and then from the root to the 7th, a minor 7th interval, or I would just recommend writing a minor 3rd at the top. For the minor 7th, you have a minor triad at the bottom, and then from root to 7th, a minor 7th. For the half diminished 7th, you have a diminished triad at the bottom, and then you build a minor 7th from root to 7th. What I would do is do a diminished triad and then write a major 3rd from the 5th to the 7th. That's a lot easier to do. And then finally, diminished 7th. This is really all minor 3rds essentially, but diminished triad, diminished 7th, just stack a minor 3rd on top of the 5th and you'll be okay there. All right, so again, I assume you all know this already. Now, we're ultimately going to be getting into the issue of figured bass, but let's first make sure we can recall some of the basics of what happens when we invert triads. So inversions of triads and 7th chords, this is all about what note is in the bass. So just to review, a root position chord has the root in the bass, or the low, whatever the lowest sounding voice is, that's the bass. First inversion has the 3rd of the chord in the bass. Second inversion has the 5th of the chord in the bass. Third inversion has the 7th in the bass. And of course, that's only possible if you have a 7th chord. So that's some very general terminology. Now, in order to have a shorthand for talking about inversions of chords, we're going to use what's called figures. So these are going to be some numbers. And figures refer to intervals above the bass. If you ever get confused, what we're going to talk about from now on, just remember these numbers refer simply to general intervals above the bass, like the size of the interval. Is it a 3rd or a 4th, and so on. So each position of a triad or a 7th chord has a unique pattern of intervals above the bass. And for your standpoint, it's important that you memorize both the full figures for each position, that is, all the numbers that would happen that are above the bass, as well as the abbreviated figures. We're going to use the abbreviated figures most often in this class, but you still need to remember what the full figures are because it's going to come in important at various times. So again, this next bit should be pretty familiar to you. A root position triad has the intervals 5/3, so it's a 5/3 chord. The abbreviation is to put nothing. First inversion is 6/3, and the abbreviation is to put a 6. So we get rid of the 3. That tends to be one aspect of the figures, is that they tend to always get rid of the 3 because the 3rd above the bass is kind of assumed. And then second inversion, where the 5th of the chord is in the bass, is 6/4, and the abbreviation is the same thing. All right, and I did not include a figure for, an example of this because I assume most of you know what this is. However, what you might have forgotten at this point would be what happens for the figures for 7th chords. So I do have a musical example to show for this. Root position is 753. So root position just tells you the intervals above the base, and the abbreviation is 7. So if you just see a 7 in the figures, that means root position, 7th chord. First inversion is 653, and we abbreviate that to 6-5. Okay? So again, get rid of the 3. That's like the one thing that tends to be true, except actually for this next one, which is second inversion with the 5th in the base of the 7th chord is 6-4-3. It's abbreviated to 4-3. All right, so second inversion, 4-3. And then third inversion, 6-4-2, abbreviated to 4-2, or just 2. So notice again, these are just showing you the intervals above the base. Now you may be wondering, what's the logic behind these abbreviated ones? Well, if you look at it, it's kind of showing you where the root is and where the 7th is. They always give you the figures to make sure you know where the root and 7th are. 6 and 5, you'll see that the 6th and the 5th above the base, that's the root and the 7th of the chord. Same thing with the 4-3. This is the root and the 7th, so 4 and 3 above the base. And then 4-2, that's why it used to be called 2, because actually all you need is the 2 to know where the root and the 7th are. All right, so now that we have all that stuff out of the way, and if you feel you need to review any of this stuff, I would probably recommend you pause the video now and do a little review, quiz yourself, but I'm kind of assuming most of you have already heard this before. So I want to spend most of my time talking about how to read a figured bass, because this is going to be one thing that we're going to be utilizing when we're doing part writing, is the tradition of a figured bass, sort of associated with Baroque era music, a shorthand for performers to know what notes to play above a given bass. So a figured bass kind of looks like this at the bottom. It would just be a single bass note with figures underneath it, and then this is sort of what the performer would play. They would fill out these chords above it. So one thing to keep in mind is that we need to be thinking about keys. You gotta consider the key signatures for figured bass. In general, figured bass will follow the given key signature, except when a note is chromatically altered. So if you see nothing next to a pitch, then that means whatever notes you write with the figures, then you know that the notes you're writing above it are just gonna be within the key signature. And also abbreviated figures are going to be used for the most part, except also when there's some sort of chromatic alteration. So we need to kind of piggyback on what we just learned about the abbreviated figures. And then, so everything else is really about accidentals. Well, how do you know how to read the accidentals? One little tricky thing, who knows why they decided to do that, is that if you just see an accidental by itself, with no number next to it, like this one. See how there's a flat sign, but there's no number next to it? That refers to the 3rd above the bass. All right, that's just one little quirk of figured bass, is that if you just see an accidental by itself, you kind of imagine a 3 next to it. All right, that's just sort of implied for this activity. All right. Other than that, really, for the most part, you're going to just be seeing sharp, natural, and flat symbols. It just tells you what the actual literal accidental that you use is. If they put a flat next to it, then that means you really do write a flat. And then also there's some other symbols that indicate raising a pitch by a half step, and that would include both the slash through the number. So a slash through a number here of the 6, that means raise the 6th above the bass. And also the plus sign next to a number. That also means raise it by a half step. So keep in mind you will have to think about the key signature if you think about raising it. Make sure that if you're raising a flat, for example, that it becomes a natural. Now let's take a look at this example here before I give you one to try on your own. And just talk about maybe how you would go about doing a figured bass. I think there's sort of a long way to do figured bass and a shorter way, and it's good to know both of them, I suppose. Ultimately, you'd want to use the shorter way, but in some cases, maybe you'll get a figure that looks confusing to you, and you'll want to be able to go back and default to the long way. The longest way to do this, let's imagine we're trying to do this, we don't have the answer yet, would be simply to follow the figures. This tells you that above this C, the sixth above the bass is flatted. So the sixth above the bass, C, is an A flat, and we write an A flat. Then you have to keep in mind that there's an implied 3. Anytime these figures have, you sort of this implied 3, so you also need to write a third above the bass, and there you go. I don't know, to me that's a little bit of a long-winded way of doing this, but it's also possible. What I recommend doing, and well, in some cases this may not be shorter, would be to use your knowledge of inversions and figures. For example, here, before I even do any of my, let's use this third one. I have a D in the bass and I see a 6/4, and I also see that I need to raise the 6th and raise the 4th. Now, one thing I could do, but you could just follow this very literally in this case, but I could also just say 6/4. That means second inversion triad, right? We learned that 6/4 means second inversion triad. That means the 5th is in the bass. So if D is the 5th, that means that the root of this chord must be the note G, some sort of G. Now in this case, that note's going to be altered. But what you could do at the very beginning here is, since G is going to be the root, and this is a triad, we know that we have some sort of G and some sort of B in the chord. Sorry about the sloppiness there. And then you can make the alterations. Then you see, well, I need to raise the 4th above the bass, and then you add the G sharp. And I need to raise the 6th above the bass, which would be the B. And since this is a B flat in the key signature, I make it a B natural, okay? So with that in mind, you can take a moment if you want to pause the video now and look through these and make sure you understand them. But let's go ahead and try one of these out on our own. Now, I've given you the same key signature of 2 flats, and I want to see if you can come up with the right answers on your own about these. So essentially follow what you saw in the previous example, write down the notes that would be remaining, but also in order to do some analysis and to work on what we've been talking about in this lesson, I also want you to write the root, chord type, and abbreviated figures for every chord. For example, I'll do the first one for demonstration. I see a 6 above the bass, so I think first inversion triad, right? So therefore, that means the B flat here is the 3rd of the chord. I don't see any accidentals, so that means it's just going to be the diatonic notes. So that means if G is the root, the other notes I need are G, B flat, and D. I already have the B flat, so just kind of write the G and the D, and there we go. But then I also want you to write down the root, type, and position. This G, B flat, D, that's a G minor triad. And it's in first inversion, so G minor 6. So that's what I mean by also writing down the chord symbol here. All right, so go ahead and pause the video now and take several minutes to complete the rest of these, and then we'll take a look at my answer sheet. Okay, now that you've had time to try this out on your own, let's take a look at my answers. We already did the first one together. Let me zoom in a little bit on a few of these so you can check them one by one. Now, the notes you write, don't worry about what register you've written them. You can even use the area above the bass and the bass clef. It doesn't matter. Any realization is possible, as long as you have the correct pitches. So notice on this first one that since there was a sharp by itself, I knew to raise the 3rd above the bass. Remember, lonely accidental means 3rd above the bass, and that was a D major minor 7th chord. This one was a first inversion triad because it's a 6, so therefore some sort of F was the root. I have to raise that pitch though, and that makes a F sharp diminished 6. Here, don't forget if you see a plus sign next to the note, that means raise it. So the 4th above the bass is some sort of F, becomes F sharp. And 4-2 means 3rd inversion 7th chord, right? So you could have just figured out immediately that the root of this chord must be D, and then wrote like that. In this case, there's a lonely flat above the bass. Therefore, that means the third above the bass, so you need to lower the G to a G flat, making an E flat minor chord. Here, by the way, I put this just in parentheses to show it's really a diatonic note, because over here we have the G flat. This was the diatonic chord. This was pretty tricky just in the key signature. So if you made a mistake here, you may have forgotten about what notes were in the key signature. This is an A half diminished chord. And you know that because you see a diminished triad, A, C, E flat. Then from the E flat to the G, you have a major third. And then finally, the last one is a C sharp diminished 4/3 chord, because I had both the natural next to the 6 and the sharp next to the 4. Okay, so there you go.